What happens when two black teenagers walk confidently toward their first-class seats and are told, without hesitation, "You don't belong here"? What if the woman who stops them doesn't know that their father is not just any parent, but the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, who also happens to be watching it unfold in real time? And, more importantly, what if he decides not to lash out, but to let truth do the talking and let silence become a microphone? This isn't just a story about a gate. It's about the invisible lines drawn in airports, boardrooms, and mines. It's about what happens when dignity is denied and a family refuses to shrink in the face of injustice. From whispered apologies to public reckonings, from gate confrontations to federal hearings. This story will make you ask, how many times have we looked away, and what happens when someone finally looks back? If you've ever faced quiet prejudice or walked with hidden power, you need to hear what the Cross family did next. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your voice matters, and this story is just getting started. The airport hummed with its usual chaos, families pulling wheeled suitcases, business travelers glued to their phones, flight announcements bouncing off high ceilings like background noise on loop. Gate C41 sat at the far end of the concourse. The leather chairs in the premium boarding zone were only half full. That's where 17-year-old Nia Cross stood, straight-backed, quietly observing the tension around her. She adjusted the strap of her canvas backpack and nudged her younger brother, Malik, who was scrolling aimlessly through his phone. "Stop zoning out," she murmured. "You're drawing stares." "I'm not the one wearing an afro pick in my hair," Malik said without looking up. Nia rolled her eyes, half smiling despite the tightness forming in her chest. They'd been through this routine before, being watched, questioned, doubted, but today felt different. Maybe it was the gate agent's eyes, sharp, calculating, with the kind of skepticism Nia had seen in security guards and store clerks. Or maybe it was the way the man in the blazer subtly clutched his leather briefcase tighter when they sat next to him. Their father, Julian Cross, had told them to go ahead and wait at the gate. His board meeting was running longer than expected, and he didn't want them to miss the early boarding call. "He'll meet us on the plane," Nia had reassured Malik confidently. Now, with the time ticking toward boarding, the only thing that seemed to be taking off was the discomfort in the air. "Zone 1. Please prepare to board." The overhead speaker called. Pamela Strickland, the primary gate agent, tapped her touchscreen with mechanical precision. Mid-50s, hair tied back in a tight twist, lips set in a permanent frown. Her name tag was clipped so straight it might have been measured by a ruler. Nia stepped forward, smile ready. "Hi, we're Zone 1, Chicago flight." She extended her phone, the digital boarding passes bright against the screen. Malik stepped up beside her, taller than his sister now, his posture relaxed but respectful. Pamela didn't take the phone. She narrowed her eyes at the two teenagers. "These are premium boarding passes." "Yes, ma'am," Nia replied. "Our dad booked them through his executive account. He's meeting us on board." Pamela glanced at her colleague, Derek Lynn, who was checking in other passengers to the side. He paused mid-keystroke, watching silently. "And where is your father?" she asked, tone flat. "In a meeting," Malik answered. "He'll be boarding in about 10 minutes. But we're confirmed passengers. You can scan Pamela, cut him off." "I don't think so. Premium boarding passes don't get handed out to unaccompanied minors." Nia's throat tightened. She glanced at Derek again. He looked away. We're not unaccompanied. He's here in the terminal." "That's not the same," Pamela said. "Now step aside. I need to process actual priority passengers." Her voice had shifted, louder, enough for a few heads to turn. A man behind them muttered something under his breath about entitled kids. Nia's voice stayed soft but firm. "Ma'am, you're making an assumption. Please just scan the passes." Pamela crossed her arms. "I've worked this gate for 18 years. I know when a boarding pass doesn't match the passenger." Malik looked up from his phone, his voice low but shaking. "That's not what this is about." "Is it?" Pamela ignored him. "Derek, notify security. We've got a possible boarding fraud." Nia reached for her phone again. "I'm calling my father." "Good. You do that," Pamela said, turning back to her monitor. The low hum of the terminal suddenly felt too loud, the air around them too still. Nearby, passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, watching without speaking. One older woman clutched her pearls. A businessman stepped subtly out of the way. Derek hesitated, phone in hand. He didn't dial right away. Nia walked a few steps back, pressing the phone to her ear. One ring, two. "Come on." "Dad." Malik stood in front of her, arms crossed now, his face flushing red from a cocktail of shame and disbelief. They had flown dozens of times. But somehow, no matter how far their father had climbed, how many Fortune 500 lists he'd landed on, to someone like Pamela Strickland, they were still out of place. On the fourth ring, the call connected. Julian Cross stepped out of the glass-walled conference room, his tailored navy suit catching the reflections of the terminal's morning sun. He had excused himself mid-sentence, something he never did in investor briefings. But the moment he saw Nia's name flash across his phone, something in his chest had tightened a familiar pressure that had nothing to do with corporate deadlines or quarterly projections. He tapped the screen and answered, already in motion. "Dad." Nia's voice came through, low and tense. "They're not letting us board. They think the passes aren't ours." Julian's footsteps slowed. "Where are you now, Gate C41? Security might be coming." Julian's jaw tensed. "Put me on speaker." She didn't respond, but the next sound he heard was his daughter's breathing, shaky but controlled. "This is Julian Cross," he said clearly. "My children are confirmed on Flight 384 to Chicago. They are holding valid premium boarding passes booked under my Executive Platinum account." "Who am I speaking to?" A pause. Then, the clipped voice of Pamela Strickland. "This is Ms. Strickland. Gate operations. Sir, anyone can claim that over the phone. These minors attempted to board using premium credentials without proper guardian verification." Given the circumstances, Julian didn't raise his voice, but each word sliced with precision. "Given the circumstances, Ms. Strickland, I suggest you verify the account now. My membership ID is 901-441, look it up. The booking is under Julian Cross. The passengers are Nia Cross and Malik Cross. They are my children." His tone wasn't angry. It was the calm of a man who had been here before. Too many times. A man who had built an empire through grit, brilliance, and more patience than anyone deserved to be tested for. There was a pause. Typing in the background, then a different voice spoke. Derek Lynn. Mr. Cross, we see the booking now. It checks out. They're listed as authorized travelers." Julian didn't hesitate. "Good. Now, scan their boarding passes and let them proceed." "But sir," Pamela interjected, her voice tight, "company policy requires." "There is no policy that allows you to detain 2 children with verified passes," Julian replied coldly. If you're unsure, I suggest escalating to someone who understands both the law and liability." A silence bloomed at the gate. Nia could feel everyone watching, each glance another pebble thrown into her composure. Malik stood next to her, silent now, head lowered but fists clenched. Pamela didn't respond. She stepped back from the counter and tapped her monitor, hands trembling slightly. Derek scanned the boarding passes. 2 green beeps. "Verified," he said softly. He didn't look up. "You're all set," Pamela said flatly. "You can board now," but neither Nia nor Malik moved. "We'll wait for our dad," Nia said. Pamela's eyes narrowed. "If you don't board now, you risk losing your seats." A voice behind them spoke up, measured, firm. "I think under the circumstances, they're entitled to wait." The speaker was a woman in her early 60s. Silver hair swept back neatly, a navy trench coat folded over her arm. Her boarding pass peeked out of her passport. "My name is Iris Caldwell," she continued. "I've been standing here since this began. These young people have been nothing but respectful. What happened here was unnecessary." Pamela's mouth twitched into a tight line. "Ma'am, this is a security matter." "No, it was a judgment call," Iris replied, her voice sharp now. "And it was wrong." Other passengers started to murmur, some clearly uncomfortable, others quietly agreeing. One man held his phone up discreetly, recording. Derek glanced at Pamela, then back at the kids. "I can hold the lane open until your father arrives," he offered, voice barely audible. "I'll mark the delay as operational review." Pamela shot him a look, but he didn't retract the offer. Malik finally spoke. "You didn't even scan our passes at first," he said to Pamela, voice low but steady. "You looked at us and just decided." Nia placed a hand on his arm. Her eyes were burning, but her voice didn't shake. "We'll wait for our father." They stepped to the side, standing silently by the window where sunlight stretched across the carpet like a spotlight. Nia stared out at the tarmac, where the aircraft stood waiting, almost mockingly calm. She wasn't surprised this had happened. Just tired. So tired. At the far end of the concourse, Julian Cross moved with the kind of quiet determination that made people instinctively step aside. He passed travelers with roller bags and coffee cups, past screens listing destinations and delays. His phone buzzed again. Aubrey, his assistant. "Need me to intervene," she had texted. He typed back, "Not yet, but prep PR." As he walked, his mind replayed the incident again and again, Nia's voice, the implication. The way strangers always seemed so quick to question what he had earned. And now they were doing it to his children. That was the part that wouldn't sit still in his chest. Julian Cross was not used to running in airports, but in that moment, he wasn't Julian the CEO. He wasn't the keynote speaker at tomorrow's summit. He was just a father, and his children were being humiliated, again, for a reason that had nothing to do with policy or protocol. He passed gate C-36. His shoes clicked fast across the linoleum. By C-39, he could see the crowd forming near C-41. Phones were out. Eyes turned as he approached. Even from a distance, he recognized Nia's posture, shoulders drawn tight, arms folded, not angry but holding herself together. Malik stood slightly behind her, silent but alert, like a spring-pulled taut. Julian slowed as he neared the group. It wasn't that he needed to catch his breath. He needed to read the room. The tension was thick. Pamela Strickland stood behind her podium like it was a shield. Derek Lynn shifted beside her, clearly uncomfortable. The security officers hadn't arrived yet, but judging by the anxious glances exchanged near the counters, they'd been called. Julian stepped directly in front of his children. "Are you all right?" Nia nodded quickly. Malik didn't speak. Julian placed a firm hand on each of their shoulders before turning to the gate agents. "My name is Julian Cross. I believe you've spoken with me." Pamela blinked, startled by his calm presence. "Yes, we've already cleared the boarding passes. I'm aware. I was told they were initially denied." "Sir, this is a matter of airline protocol," Pamela began. Julian raised a hand gently, not to interrupt her, to contain her. "No, this is a matter of perception and assumption, and the kind of decision-making that comes from prejudice masquerading as policy." Her mouth opened, but she couldn't find words. Julian's voice was low, deliberate. "When my children approached this gate, they were not greeted with protocol. They were greeted with suspicion, the kind of suspicion that assumes black youth don't belong in premium boarding lines, the kind that ignores credentials and goes straight to security." Pamela bristled. "Sir, I treat all passengers the same." Julian nodded. "I'm sure that's what you believe." He turned to Derek. "You saw what happened?" Derek looked pained. I hesitated. That's on me." Julian didn't lecture him. That admission was enough for now. Captain Ethan Rourke arrived then, tall and composed in his uniform, flat bag still in hand. His eyes scanned the gate, taking in the shifting crowd, the way Pamela's arms were folded, how Nia's hands were clenched into fists. "Mr. Cross," he said, approaching. "I'm Captain Rourke. I delayed the flight. I wanted to speak to you directly." Julian shook his hand. "Thank you for doing that. I appreciate it." The captain glanced at Pamela. "We'll make up the time in the air, but I wasn't comfortable taking off until I knew what happened here." Julian nodded. "I'd like to speak privately once we're airborne." "Of course," from behind them. Iris Caldwell stepped forward again. She addressed Captain Rourke directly. "Captain, I've traveled enough to know when something's off. Those children were treated differently, not because of protocol, because of how they look." The captain gave a short, respectful nod. "Thank you, ma'am." Julian looked around the terminal. All eyes were still on them, all ears listening. "To the passengers," he said quietly, "you may be inconvenienced today. You may think this is about delays, but my children were treated like criminals for doing nothing wrong. And if that doesn't give us all pause, it should." Silence fell. Even the loudspeakers seemed to quiet themselves. Pamela finally spoke, voice stiff. "We've confirmed their identity. They're cleared to board. There's been a misunderstanding." Julian's eyes didn't soften. "No, there was a failure. Let's not soften that word. My children deserve better, and so do yours. So do all of ours." He turned to Nia and Malik. "We're boarding now." As they passed the counter, Pamela didn't meet their eyes. Derek murmured, "I'm sorry. Genuinely." Julian paused for half a breath, then said, "Be better next time." Once inside the jetway, the energy shifted. The artificial chill of the gate fell away. The air was heavier now, not from pressure, but from the emotional gravity of what had just happened. They stepped into the cabin. The flight attendant at the front, a man with a polished smile, glanced at their seat assignments and waved them toward the front row seats. First class, window and aisle, wide seats, silk pillows, complimentary drinks. Nia settled into the window seat, her backpack tucked at her feet. Malik flopped into the aisle seat beside her. Julian didn't sit immediately. He turned and looked back down the jetway, where the captain was quietly speaking to the crew. He had a strange feeling in his chest. Pride, exhaustion, fury carefully sheathed in steel. He sat down beside his children just as the first boarding group trickled in. Nia didn't look at him right away. She whispered, "I'm okay. You shouldn't have to be." Julian replied. Malik finally spoke. She didn't even scan us. She just decided. Julian's hand clenched the armrest. He knew this feeling. Not new, not rare, just more bitter this time because it wasn't him who had to endure it. It was them. He looked at his children and quietly made a decision that would change far more than a single flight. The plane hummed beneath them, a low, mechanical lullaby that usually put Malik to sleep before takeoff. But today, the vibrations felt like a warning, subtle, unrelenting. Nia sat beside him, arms folded tightly across her chest. She stared straight ahead, not at the screen or the magazine tucked into the seat pocket, just ahead. Her body was still, but her jaw worked back and forth, silently grinding through the discomfort. Julian Cross sat across the aisle, his long frame tucked into the premium window seat. He hadn't taken off his blazer. That was unusual. Normally, once seated, he relaxed, took a breath, loosened his collar, but now he sat perfectly upright, one hand resting gently on his knee, the other clutching his phone like a paperweight of purpose. A flight attendant stopped beside them. "Mr. Cross, can I offer you anything before takeoff? Just water." "Thank you," he said, voice smooth but distant. The woman nodded and retreated. Julian looked at his children. Nia caught his glance and quickly looked away. "You can talk to me," he said gently. She exhaled through her nose. Her voice came out small. "I don't want to make it worse." "You didn't make anything worse. You stood up. I didn't even say anything at first. You didn't have to. They saw you. That was enough to doubt you." Malik shifted. "That's the part I can't shake, that she didn't even scan. She saw us and decided." Julian leaned in, elbows on knees. "I've been in this suit for 20 years, and I've still been asked to fetch coffee in my own conference rooms." He smiled sadly. "Once, someone handed me their dry cleaning at a hotel and asked me to rush it before the next morning's keynote." "You didn't get angry?" Malik asked. I smiled and said I'd make sure it was pressed perfectly. Then I walked onto the stage an hour later and opened the summit. "That's messed up," Malik muttered. "It is," Julian said, "but sometimes the most powerful response isn't rage, it's excellence, because excellence reveals the failure of their expectations." Malik nodded slowly, but his face was tight, like the words didn't soothe, only deepen the wound. Nia finally looked over. "So what happens now?" Julian's gaze returned to his phone. "Now, we make sure it doesn't happen again." Across the aisle, a woman leaned slightly toward them. Her voice was soft but intentional. "Excuse me. I couldn't help overhearing earlier. It was Iris Caldwell." She was seated in the row behind Julian, a book open on her tray but forgotten. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry you had to go through that." She said to Nia and Malik, "Not everyone thinks that way." "Thank you," Nia said quietly. Julian gave her a nod of gratitude. He'd heard variations of that sentiment before, well-meaning, often sincere, but rarely followed by action. But something about Iris felt different. She was watching, not explaining, not defending, simply witnessing. I saw what happened, she continued, and I've already written to the airline from my phone. I plan to follow up. If that means anything, it does. Julian said, "It really does." The intercom crackled, and the voice of Captain Rourke came through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 384 to Chicago. We'll be pushing back from the gate momentarily. Estimated flight time is 2 hours and 12 minutes. We're expecting smooth skies today." Julian looked at his children. He wanted to ask if they were okay, but the question felt insulting in the aftermath. Instead, he reached across the aisle and rested a hand on Malik's shoulder. Malik didn't say anything, but he didn't move away either. As the engines roared to life and the plane began to taxi, Julian opened the Notes app on his phone, not to work, not this time. He began drafting a different kind of document. First line. "When systems fail children, they do so loudly even when the children stay silent." He stared at the sentence, then kept writing, 20 minutes into the flight. The seatbelt sign blinked off with a soft chime. Julian stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the galley. A flight attendant noticed him and nodded. "Captain Rourke would like to see you now." "Sir, he's expecting you in the cockpit." Julian followed her down the narrow aisle. As he passed, a few passengers glanced up. Some pretended not to recognize him. Others didn't try to hide it. He reached the cockpit, the door opened, and Captain Rourke stood to greet him, gesturing to the small jump seat behind the co-pilot. "Come in. I'm glad we could speak mid-flight." Julian sat, folding his hands. The hum of the avionics filled the cramped space. Co-pilot Michael Yates nodded at him politely before turning back to his instruments. "I want to start by saying I'm sorry for what happened at the gate," the captain began. "It wasn't just inappropriate. It was unacceptable." Julian nodded once. "I appreciate that. But it's not just about my kids. It's about what kind of system allows it to keep happening. That's exactly why I wanted to talk. The truth is, I've been raising concerns about this for years quietly, internally. There's never been a tipping point. Until today." Julian raised an eyebrow. "Why now?" "Because it happened to your family. And because you have a platform, people will listen." "They should have listened to the dozens before," Julian said, his voice sharpening. "Not just to the guy in a suit." "I agree," Rourke said quietly. "But sometimes it takes the right voice at the right time. I think you might be that voice." Julian leaned back against the padded wall. He was quiet for a long moment. "Then maybe it's time I speak louder." The cockpit wasn't built for long conversations. Space was tight. Voices had to stay low, and the rhythm of flight operations pulsed beneath every word. But for Captain Ethan Rourke, there was no better time to talk than midair. No interruptions, no gate agents, just altitude and truth. Julian Cross leaned forward in the jump seat, elbows resting on his knees. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, focused. Ethan watched him for a moment before speaking. "I've seen this before, you know. Not the exact situation, but the pattern. Passengers of color treated like outliers the moment they don't fit someone's expectation of where they belong." Julian nodded slowly. Expectations are tricky things, especially when they're shaped by bias no one wants to admit they carry. "I've filed reports over the years," Ethan continued. "Quiet ones. Incidents that felt wrong. That looked wrong, but they never went anywhere. Once the flight lands, everyone moves on. Management shrugs, HR issues a statement, and it happens again. That's the problem with silence, Julian said. It makes room for repetition. Exactly. Julian looked through the tiny window in the cockpit. Clouds drifted by like layers of truth slowly being peeled back. "What do you want to see change?" he asked. Ethan didn't hesitate. "I want real accountability. Training that doesn't just check boxes but actually forces people to examine themselves. Complaint systems that don't just bury reports under paperwork, and consequences that are more than a memo in a personnel file. That's a tall order. So is running a tech company while raising 2 black kids in a country that still sees them as a threat at the gate." Ethan let out a quiet breath. Part agreement, part frustration. The co-pilot glanced at him. "You want to tell him?" Ethan looked at Julian. "The truth is, other pilots are watching this. Word spreads fast through flight crews. What happened today? They're not okay with it either. How many are we talking about? 6 have already said they'll support any formal complaint you make. Some are even talking about refusing to fly until they know the airline takes this seriously." Julian's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his energy. Stillness deepened, the kind of stillness that comes right before movement. "I didn't ask for that. You didn't have to. This is bigger than you now." Julian glanced down at his phone, then tucked it back into his inner jacket pocket. "What's the name of your CEO, Thomas Granger? How's his track record, old school? Traditional? Not a bad man, but definitely not proactive. Doesn't like controversy, especially the kind that messes with numbers. Then maybe it's time we mess with numbers," Julian said quietly. Ethan tilted his head, studying him. "You planning something?" Julian didn't answer right away. When he did, it wasn't a strategy. It was a promise. "I won't let this fade. Not this time." The plane dipped slightly as it entered its initial descent pattern. A soft chime sounded through the speakers, signaling passengers to prepare for landing. Ethan adjusted the radio frequency. "We'll be wheels down in 20 minutes. Smooth approach, clear skies." He looked at Julian. "When we land, Granger will be waiting at the gate." Julian's eyebrow lifted. "That's fast. I called him while you were boarding, told him who you were, told him what happened, and he came. He's not the kind to ignore storms when they gather this close to the tarmac." Julian gave a small nod, more acknowledgement than agreement. "I'll speak with him, but I'm not interested in apologies. I want action." Ethan extended his hand across the cockpit. "Then let's start something that doesn't end with this flight." Julian shook it firmly. "Agreed." He rose, gave a nod to the co-pilot, and stepped out of the cockpit. As he moved back through the cabin, the atmosphere shifted subtly. Eyes followed him, some curious, some cautious, some quietly admiring. He returned to his seat. Nia looked up from her tablet, eyes questioning. "Everything okay?" Julian gave a small nod. "For now." Malik peered over the seat. "Did he apologize?" "He didn't have to." Julian said, "Not yet," but he listened. The flight attendant approached and offered a bottle of water. "Mr. Cross, let us know if there's anything else we can do." Julian thanked her politely. As she stepped away, he turned back to his children. "There's going to be a conversation when we land with the airline's CEO." Nas sat straighter. "The CEO of the whole company." "Yes." Malik frowned. "Are they just trying to make it go away?" "Probably," Julian said. "That's why we won't let them." Nia leaned in. "What are you thinking?" Julian's voice dropped slightly. I'm thinking we ask for more than an apology. What do you mean? I mean, change. Policy, training, transparency, and public accountability. Malik grinned. That sounds like you? Julian gave a small smile in return, then paused. This isn't just about me anymore, or even just about you. This is about every kid who ever stood at a gate and got told they didn't belong. He reached over and took both their hands. So, if we do this, we do it together. And from across the aisle, Iris Caldwell, who had been listening quietly, whispered just loud enough for them to hear. I'm with you too. The tires touched down on Chicago runway 28 right with a soft jolt and a long, smooth roll. The aircraft slowed, shifted, turned toward the gate, and the familiar robotic chime echoed through the cabin. Passengers stirred, unbuckling, stretching, returning to their routines as if nothing life-altering had just happened in the air. But for Nia and Malik Cross, nothing felt routine. The tension in their shoulders hadn't left. It had only shifted places. As the plane taxied to Gate A7, Julian remained still in his seat. He didn't reach for his bag. He didn't scroll through his emails. He sat like a man studying wind patterns before choosing how to open a door. The intercom crackled. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chicago. We'll be arriving at Gate A7 in just a few minutes. On behalf of the crew, thank you for flying with us. We ask that all passengers remain seated until the aircraft has come to a full stop. Captain Rourke's voice carried a calm that felt personal, intentional, like he was speaking directly to the Cross family, even if the rest of the cabin didn't know it. When the aircraft finally parked and the seatbelt sign dinged off, a wave of movement erupted. Passengers stood, reaching for bags, bumping elbows, mumbling about connections and overhead bins. Julian didn't move. Neither did his children. Nia looked out the window. There were 4 figures standing just beyond the glass, clearly not regular airport personnel. 2 wore suits. 1 had a lanyard with a corporate badge, and at the center was a tall, older man with silver hair and a tight expression that didn't quite qualify as a smile. Thomas Granger. Julian finally stood. He straightened his jacket with a quiet precision. Then he looked at Nia and Malik. You don't have to come with me if you're not ready. We're coming, Malik said instantly. Nia gave a small nod. We belong in that room, too. Julian smiled, not wide, but proud. Then let's go. As they stepped into the aisle, a few passengers paused their rustling. One woman offered a small, encouraging smile. A man stepped aside to give them space. Iris Caldwell caught Julian's eye and gave him a single nod. You have witnesses. The jet bridge was cool and sterile. The sound of luggage wheels echoed faintly behind them. At the end of the walkway, Granger was waiting. He extended his hand as Julian approached. Mr. Cross, thank you for agreeing to speak with me. Julian shook his hand. Firm and measured. Let's keep this direct. Of course, I've reserved a conference room upstairs. Private. Quiet. Julian glanced at his children, then back at Granger. No need. We'll speak right here. Granger blinked, caught off guard. Here. This is where it happened, Julian said. Let's not pretend it belongs behind closed doors. Passengers continued exiting behind them, some slowing as they passed, some watching from a distance. Whispers began. Phones stayed out, low in hands, recording just in case. Granger glanced around, visibly uncomfortable now. I want to offer my sincere apology on behalf of the airline. What occurred at Gate C-41 was unacceptable. Julian didn't blink, and yet it happened. Yes, but, and it wasn't new, was it not isolated? Just the first time it reached someone like me. Granger inhaled slowly, as if rehearsing a script he no longer believed in. I understand the optics. Stop, Julian said. This isn't about optics. It's about systems. Ones that tolerate bias as long as the paperwork's clean and the flight departs on time. Granger looked at Nia and Malik, perhaps hoping to soften the moment. You both handled yourselves with grace. Malik's eyes narrowed. We shouldn't have had to. That's the truth, Nia added. We were treated like we didn't belong, and you can't undo that with compliments. Julian turned slightly, so his voice projected toward the hallway. Not just the man in front of him. I don't want a settlement. I don't want a press release. I want policy change. Granger nodded slowly. We can look into diversity retraining, review of hiring protocols. No, Julian interrupted. That's not enough. I want an independent investigation into gate-level practices. I want anonymous reporting channels for passengers and staff, and I want a commitment that this won't be buried after the media cycle ends. Granger opened his mouth, but Julian kept going. And I want it in writing, publicly posted. Granger paused. He glanced again at the quiet witnesses forming a loose circle around them. Employees, passengers, flight crew, even Captain Rourke, still in uniform, stood near the jet bridge door, arms folded across his chest. You'll have it, Granger said finally. I'll start the process today. No more starting, Julian said. Start finishing. Granger gave a small, defeated nod. He looked at the children again, this time with something closer to humility. I hope one day you'll give us a chance to earn your trust back. Malik tilted his head. We'll see. Julian took his children's hands, one on each side. They turned and walked down the hallway as whispers continued in their wake. Each footstep pressed into the patterned carpet like a signature, like a new line being drawn. They didn't say much as they made their way through the terminal. They didn't have to. But when they passed Gate C-41 on the way to the car service area, Malik paused. What? Look at the carpet. Nia and Julian turned. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting shadows along the patterned floor. Red lines met gold ones. Blue stripes formed borders that only meant something if you imagined they did. It looks like a map, Malik said. Maybe it is, Julian replied, and we just redrew it. The car was silent, not the heavy silence of anger, but the kind that wrapped itself around reflection like a coat you didn't remember putting on. Chicago blurred past the windows' brick buildings, glass towers, people with umbrellas crossing streets where the summer rain had just dried, but inside the back seat of the black SUV, Julian, Nia, and Malik sat in their own stillness. Malik finally broke the quiet. Did we do the right thing? Julian turned from the window. You mean speaking up? Yeah, I mean, what if that woman loses her job, or what if nothing actually changes, and we just stirred the pot for no reason? Julian let the question breathe. He could see Nia watching him too, waiting for the answer she hadn't said out loud. Doing the right thing doesn't guarantee comfort, he said quietly. Sometimes it costs you something, but silence costs more. Nia spoke up, her voice softer than usual. What if I'd just smiled and said thank you? Let her push us aside. Would that have made her feel better? Would we be in Chicago now with a little less noise? You would have made her more comfortable, Julian said. but not more, just... He looked at her with something like ache in his eyes. And I never raised you to shrink for someone else's comfort. Malik looked down at his hands. He had chipped a thumbnail at some point during the flight, and now he was picking at it without realizing. She didn't even know us, he said. She didn't know our names, our history, our story, but she made up a version of it the second she saw us. Julian reached over and rested a hand on his son's knee. That's the hardest part. Not that they doubt you after you speak, but that they decide who you are before you open your mouth. The car pulled up to the hotel, a quiet boutique place near the river. The driver opened the doors. As they stepped out, a man in a navy suit held the lobby door open. "Mr. Cross, your suite is ready. Let us know if you'd like the conference room prepared. The press is waiting, but we've cleared the west wing so your family can have privacy." Julian nodded. "Thank you. We'll be down shortly." Once in the suite, Nia went straight to the window, staring out at the river walk below. Malik wandered toward the minibar, pulled out a ginger ale, then changed his mind and left it unopened. Julian sat down on the edge of the bed. His phone buzzed again. Messages from board members, media contacts, allies, critics, friends, strangers. He scrolled past them all and opened the one that mattered. A message from Iris Caldwell. "I spoke to a reporter, not for attention, just truth. I told them your kids reminded me of the ones I used to teach. Brave, honest, and worth every inch of the fight." Julian exhaled slowly, a long, steady breath that reached deeper than his lungs. There was a knock at the door. Julian stood, opened it. A staff member handed him a sleek envelope. "Sir, this was just delivered from Airline Corporate HQ, signed by Thomas Granger himself." Julian nodded and closed the door. He opened the envelope. Inside was a formal letter typed, letter-headed, full of executive language, acknowledgement of the incident, commitment to initiate an independent review, promises of accountability, but also something else, a handwritten note at the bottom. "Mr. Cross change is overdue. If you're willing, I'd like your help rebuilding what's broken, starting with gate operations nationwide." Julian read the sentence twice. Malik came up behind him. What's it say? Julian handed him the letter, watched his eyes skim it. Then his lips curled into a quiet, disbelieving smile. "He's asking for help. Looks like it." Malik looked over at his sister. She was still by the window, sunlight catching the curls in her hair, her expression unreadable. "Hey, Nia." She turned. "He wants Dad to help fix things." Nia didn't smile, not yet, but her shoulders eased, just a little. Julian spoke gently. "They're asking now. That's different, but asking is just a beginning. Are you going to say yes?" Julian didn't answer right away. He looked at his children, two people the world tried to ignore until they were loud enough to be heard. Then he said, "Only if you both help me decide what change should look like." The quiet that followed wasn't silence. It was something else. It was permission. It was a new kind of beginning. By the next morning, the story had left the terminal and taken off at a speed even Julian couldn't have predicted. It was no longer just an incident at the gate. It had become a national conversation. Headlines sprawled across news tickers. Black teen siblings denied boarding their dad's response goes viral when bias meets first class. A CEO's call for change is your airline quietly discriminating former students, pilots, and parents speak out. Julian sat at the edge of the hotel suite's couch. coffee in hand, television muted, reading the captions. In just under 24 hours, their faces, especially Naya's, in that grainy photo someone had snapped mid-confrontation, had been shared over 6 million times. Malik had made a face in the photo, biting his lip, eyes narrowed. Now that face was trending on TikTok, and not all the attention was kind. Look at them, trying to play victim for a free upgrade. Premium seats aren't for everyone. Get over it. They're lucky they weren't arrested. This country's too soft. But alongside the bile came thousands of voices that said otherwise. I've been told you're in the wrong line more times than I can count. My 12-year-old was pulled aside flying home from a robotics competition. This isn't about seats. It's about dignity. Malik sat beside him, scrolling through the same feeds on his phone. Dad, yeah, some people think we made it up, like we planned it. Julian turned to him. Do you think the truth becomes less true because some people are afraid of it? Malik stared at the screen, then shut it off. No. Exactly. Nia entered the room, wearing an oversized sweater and leggings. She looked tired, not from lack of sleep, but from emotional overexposure. It's weird, she said, seeing my own face on a screen and knowing it means something different to every person who sees it. You've become a symbol, Julian said softly. I didn't want to be. Symbols usually don't, he replied. She sat beside him, curling her legs underneath her. What now? Now, we control what the symbol means. Julian stood, walked over to the hotel desk, and opened his laptop. On the screen, a live email thread with Granger's office blinked at the top of his inbox. They were asking for a meeting, this time with stakeholders, not just executives, but gate agents, former passengers, civil rights consultants, and they wanted Julian to help facilitate it. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Iris Caldwell. She held a paper bag and a small bouquet of tulips. I brought breakfast and a little brightness. Julian smiled and stepped aside. You didn't have to. I wanted to. I also wanted to ask, can I tell you something personal? Of course. She sat at the dining table while Malik poured juice. When I started teaching, I had a student named Ava, smart as a whip, black girl, 3rd grade. One day, we were lining up for recess and she hesitated, said she didn't want to go outside. Why, I asked. She said, because when I run, people look at me different. Julian nodded slowly. That's what this is about. Isn't it? Iris continued. Not just about flying, but about movement, about who's allowed to move freely in this country without suspicion. Julian said nothing for a moment. Then, and who gets stopped at the gate before they even take off? Exactly. They sat in silence for a while, not awkward, just real. Nia looked at Iris. Do you think it'll actually change? That something good comes from all this? I think change starts with discomfort, Iris said, and we're making a lot of people uncomfortable right now. That's not a bad sign. Julian's phone buzzed again. It was a message from Granger. We've scheduled the round table. It's public. Press is invited. We hope you'll speak. Your children, too, if they're willing. Julian passed the phone to Naya. She read it, looked up. You want us to speak only if you want to, but if you do, people will listen. Malik's voice was quiet. I think they need to hear what it felt like, not just what it looked like. Julian nodded. Then maybe we speak, together. The round table was held in a repurposed hangar just outside Terminal 4 at Chicago Midway. Folded chairs lined in a semicircle, a banner behind the speakers that read, "Elevating every passenger toward equity in the skies." It sounded polished. It sounded rehearsed. But as Julian stepped through the side curtain with Naya and Malik behind him, he knew this wasn't going to be a smooth, corporate affair. This would be personal, uncomfortable, and absolutely necessary. The panel included senior airline officials, civil rights advocates, pilot union reps, and a few gate agents who had come forward with their own stories of internal bias. But the spotlight, every lens, every camera tilted subtly toward Julian and his children. They weren't experts. They were something rarer. They were the ones it happened to. Nia leaned in as they were guided to their seats. "Do I have to go first?" Julian squeezed her hand. "You don't have to do anything. But if you speak, make it count." Granger walked across the stage. His tone was polished, but his face was tight. This wasn't easy for him. "Thank you all for joining us. Today is not about damage control. It's about deep control, about rebuilding trust where it's been broken." He gestured toward Julian. "I'd like to begin with the family whose experience helped open this conversation." Julian stood. The room quieted. Cameras clicked. He didn't step behind the podium. He didn't raise his voice. "I'd like to invite my daughter to speak first." Nia blinked, startled, but something inside her straightened. She stood slowly. The mic was clipped to her collar. 1,000 eyes, all on her. But she didn't tremble. "When I walked up to the gate that day, I wasn't expecting a red carpet. I wasn't asking for applause. I was just walking toward a seat my father had paid for, with my brother beside me, with our names on the reservation, with our passes in our hands." Her voice didn't break, but it did bend, like a branch that refuses to snap. But the woman at the gate didn't see that. She didn't see a student or a traveler. She saw something else, something she decided didn't belong in the priority line. The audience was still, and for a second, I wondered if I had done something wrong. Maybe I walked too confidently. Maybe I should have smiled. Maybe I should have looked nervous so I didn't look like a threat. She paused. Malik watched her, eyes wide, surprised at her strength. But that's the problem, right? The fact that I even had to ask myself that. She looked straight at the front row, where a flight crew in uniform was seated. "You keep telling us to follow the rules, but sometimes the rules are just another way of hiding the real problem." She sat back down, breathing hard but proud. Malik stood next. "I'm 15, and I've flown more times than I can count. School tournaments, summer camps, but I've never been pulled aside, asked to wait, ignored like I was invisible. Until last week." He glanced at his dad, and even though we got to board eventually, I keep thinking, what if my dad wasn't Julian Cross? What if he was someone without the title, without the phone number, without the suits? He shrugged. What happens to those kids? Silence met his question, the kind that stings. Julian took the mic last. My children spoke for themselves. I'll only add this. He turned slightly to face the audience fully. You've built a system that says it's fair, that says first class is for those who earn it. But that system is rigged by perception, and no ticket, no matter the price, can buy your way out of someone else's bias. He let that hang in the air, but it can buy you a platform, and I intend to use mine. He sat. For a moment, no one moved. Then a woman from the Gate Agents Union stood. "I want to thank the Cross family, because what happened to them isn't isolated. I've seen trainees make judgment calls that weren't based on policy but on profile. We've had no real training on implicit bias, just manuals and rules, but no understanding. She turned to the executives. You want to fix this? Don't just retrain. Rebuild. Others stood too. A pilot who admitted he'd seen similar profiling from his crew. A former passenger who had been mistaken for a janitor while boarding business class. A former flight attendant who revealed how her warnings about discriminatory behavior went ignored for years. By the time the session ended, the public knew something had shifted. This wasn't PR, this was truth, and truth never lands quietly. The hotel room was dim, lit only by the reflection of city lights bouncing off the river outside. The speeches were over. The headlines were written, and now came the quiet. The strange in-between that always followed loud applause. Julian Cross stood by the window, still wearing the blazer from the round table. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, but he hadn't bothered to take the lapel mic off yet. He watched his own reflection in the glass, tired eyes, a face that had stayed calm when it needed to, but now showed everything. Behind him, Malik sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through a notebook, not scrolling his phone, not gaming, just sketching. What are you drawing? Just lines, patterns, like that carpet at the gate. Julian turned from the window, the one with all the red and gold. Yeah, it looked like confusion at first, but when I stared long enough, it almost made sense. Julian walked over, sat beside him. Malik tilted the notebook so he could see. I guess I'm trying to make sense of the day. You know, in shapes. Julian smiled gently. That's how artists speak, with patterns instead of podiums. Nia stepped out from the bathroom, drying her hands. She had changed into pajamas, but her expression was still locked in that thoughtful space she entered after something big. Do you ever think we said too much? Julian looked up. Too much. Yeah, like, maybe we should have let the company handle it behind the scenes. He thought for a moment. Would that have made you feel better? No, she admitted, but it might have made everyone else more comfortable. And who are we trying to protect, them or the next kid who walks up to that same gate? She didn't respond, but she didn't need to. Julian's phone buzzed on the table. Another message. Probably another interview request or op-ed invitation, but it wasn't. It was a video. Attached was a note. I thought you should see this. Julian pressed play. A woman in a blue uniform, clearly, a gate agent, stood in a small break room, speaking to her phone. I've worked this job for 11 years. I've followed every protocol. But today, I realized I've also stayed quiet when I saw colleagues treat passengers differently because of how they looked, and that's on me. But I want to do better, and I want to thank the Cross kids, because your story gave me the push I needed to finally speak up. The video ended. Julian stared at the screen. The kids leaned over to watch it a second time. She looks nervous, Malik said. She is, Nia replied, but she said it anyway. Julian saved the video, then closed the phone. That's the start of what a shift. They sat in silence for a while. Not awkward, just honest. Then Nia spoke. What if this becomes our thing? What thing, like more than just one incident? What if we start showing up at other gates? Other stories helping people who don't have a voice? Julian looked at her. She was leaning forward now, a spark in her eyes. Not the spark of anger, but purpose. You think people would listen? They already are. Malik nodded slowly. We could call it Gate 41. Julian raised a brow. That's the gate where it happened, right? So now it becomes something else. A name people remember, not for what was done to us, but for what we did with it. Julian looked at his kids, his voice soft. You're not children anymore, are you? Malek smirked. We kind of skipped the line. Julian chuckled, then stood. He walked back to the window. Out beyond the glass, planes took off and landed in the distance, like glints of silver hope. He spoke again, not turning around. If we do this, we do it with integrity. We don't chase headlines, we chase healing. Nah and Malik looked at each other, then at him. Deal. 3 weeks later, the gate was still there. C-41, same terminal, same carpet, same metal-framed chairs, but something had changed. A small plaque had been installed on the wall beside the check-in counter. This gate was once the site of silence. Now, it's a symbol of change. Gate 41 is dedicated to every voice that was ever told it didn't belong. The Cross family didn't ask for it. The airline installed it on their own, following the first wave of reforms, quietly, without fanfare. But the media noticed, and so did the passengers. People started taking selfies beside the plaque. Students took photos for essays. Parents pointed it out to their children before boarding. Gate 41 was now more than a number. It was a statement. Julian, Naya, and Malik stood a few feet away that morning, back at the airport for a different kind of flight, a flight to D.C., where they had been invited to speak at a federal transportation equity summit. You sure about this? Julian asked, glancing at Nia. She nodded. I'm not afraid anymore. Malik adjusted the strap on his backpack. I printed the designs we made for the Gate 41 website. I think we should show them. Julian smiled. You two are turning a moment into a movement. They made their way through security. No stairs this time. Just quiet recognition. As they walked to their gate, a teenage girl with braids stopped Naya. You're her, right from the round table. Naya paused. Surprised? Yeah, I guess I am. The girl smiled shyly. I wrote about you for my civics class. Got an A. Nia laughed, warm and real. That's awesome. You made me feel like maybe I don't have to wait to be older to speak up. Nia glanced back at her dad, then to the girl. You don't. You just have to mean what you say. The girl nodded, then walked away with her mom. Julian's phone buzzed. It was another email from a major airline competitor. They wanted to host a Gate 41 training series, a series of workshops and virtual modules modeled after the Cross family's experience. They wanted input from the family, voices that weren't filtered through PR. Malik leaned over his dad's shoulder. That's the third one this week, and it won't be the last. Julian sat down and pulled out his notebook. Inside was a list, handwritten, nothing digital yet. Gate 41 project goals. Build a reporting system that protects passengers and staff. Create youth-led video testimonies across U.S. airports. Partner with civil rights orgs for training oversight. Hold quarterly public audits for transparency. Turn gate spaces into storytelling spaces. It was ambitious. Too ambitious. Some might say, but ambition was a language the Cross family had always spoken fluently. From a seat across the gate area, a man in uniform approached them. Mr. Cross, yes, Captain Navarro. I watched the hearing. I used to fly with Pamela Gate agent from your case. Julian tensed slightly, but the man's voice was calm. She resigned, not under pressure, on her own. She sent me a letter, said she didn't realize how deep her bias ran until she saw herself from the outside. Said your daughter's face haunted her in a good way. Julian didn't know what to say to that, but he appreciated the honesty. The captain tipped his head. What you're doing, it matters. As he walked away, Malik whispered, I kind of feel like we just renamed an entire gate system. Julian smiled. Not renamed, reclaimed. They boarded the plane. This time, no hesitation, no questioning, no sideways glances, as the aircraft lifted above the clouds. Nia reached over and took her father's hand. Thank you for not letting it slide. Julian looked at both his children, the city below them shrinking into a memory. I didn't raise you to let silence win. Then he looked out the window. But now, maybe we raise the volume, together, 6 months later. Gate 41 wasn't just a place anymore. It was a program, a podcast, a nonprofit, a case study, and a story retold in classrooms, training videos, boardrooms, and family dinner tables. At least 7 major airlines had adopted updated boarding equity protocols, shaped directly by input from the Cross family. 3 universities had invited Nia to speak. Malik's sketches had become part of the Gate 41 logo, red and gold lines winding into a path that looked like a runway and a heart. And yet, for the Cross family, life moved quietly. Julian still ran his tech company. Though he'd handed over day-to-day operations to a co-CEO, Nia was preparing for her first year at Howard. Malik was building a digital library of first-person stories from teens across the country, videos, drawings, voice notes, even poems. But some days, it still returned. Not the pain, not even the anger, just the memory. That moment at the gate, when silence could have swallowed them, and didn't. On one of those quiet mornings, Julian stood at a new terminal in Atlanta. He wasn't flying that day. He was there to speak at a staff conference on accountability culture in aviation. He stood by a new plaque. This one didn't say Gate 41. It simply said, belonging is not a luxury, it's a right. Check your bias before you check their ticket. He read it twice, then turned when he heard footsteps. It was Nia. She wore a soft blazer and jeans, a confident ease in her posture now earned, not borrowed. You ready? She asked. Always. They entered the auditorium together. The session began with a video montage of passenger testimonies, real voices, real pain, real resolve. Then came the questions. An older flight attendant stood up first. What do you say to someone who wants to help but is afraid to say the wrong thing? Julian answered without hesitation. Say the thing anyway. Say it with humility. Say it knowing you might stumble, but also knowing silence does more harm than mistakes ever could. A young black gate agent raised her hand. Next. Do you think we're actually making progress? Nia took that one. I think progress isn't something you see in one moment. It's in the pauses people take now. The second thought, before the snap judgment, the rethinking. That means something's changing. At the end of the session, someone asked if the Cross family ever considered trademarking the name Gate 41. Malik, who had joined via video from his art class, laughed. Nah. That gate belongs to everyone who ever had to prove they belonged. The audience applauded. Later, back in the car, Julian rested his head against the window. You tired? Nia asked. Not really, just full of what hope and a kind of grief, too. too. Grief? Yeah. For how many times this happened before us? How many people didn't have a phone, or a title, or a voice people would listen to? Nia looked out at the sky. But maybe we were the beginning of someone else's chance. Julian turned toward her. Or maybe we were the continuation of someone else's unfinished fight. They rode in silence for a while. The airport shrank behind them. But the message didn't. Somewhere, at another gate in another city, a kid stood tall in a boarding line, and the crew member behind the desk looked up and smiled, not because of fear, but because of awareness, because of Gate 41, and because of what happens when dignity, once denied, learns to fly. What began as a humiliating moment at a boarding gate became a national movement that shook an entire industry. But beneath the headlines and hashtags was a father who chose clarity over chaos, a daughter who chose courage over comfort, and a son who turned trauma into purpose. Gate 41 is no longer just a place, it's a promise that every traveler, regardless of skin, status, or stereotype, deserves dignity at the threshold of flight. As you leave this story, ask yourself, how many times have we seen it happen? How many stayed silent? And how many more voices are waiting to be heard? Discrimination hides in plain sight. But so does power, especially quiet power. So, if this story moved you, if it made you think, feel, reflect, like this video, drop a comment below, subscribe for more stories that shine a light where others look away. Let's make sure Gate 41 isn't the end, but the beginning of something greater.